Okay, so let's get started. Thanks for joining. A few people are still joining in, but let's get started anyhow. Today is an exciting day for the NCMC webinar series because it's our eighth and last of the year of 2025. This was our first year putting those webinars on the air for you, and we amassed a loyal following. So we're very happy that you're here and to see more of you joining soon. And so today we're going to have a special guest. Until now, most of the guests we had they wrote books, but Dr. Houda Abadi is a little bit of an exception. She wrote a report, which actually blew my mind, and that made me reach out to her. And so I broke a little bit the rule here and created an exception because I thought that the work she produced was of extremely valuable quality and impact in the world, and I would like to help her spread that message. So the webinar today is about reframing peace, Islamic principles, local realities, and women's inclusion. And so let's just remember, for those of you who don't know us, here's the NCMC mission. The idea is to create an open and democratic international negotiation and conflict management center that facilitates and galvanizes a global community of scholars and practitioners producing evidence-based knowledge on sustainable strategies that serve as a force for good. So please feel free to scan here the QR code if you would like to learn more about us. Now, just before I introduce our speaker more formally, let me just give you a few of the ground rules of the house rules of today's session. So the audience is muted and the video is off for the entirety of the session. The chat box is only for the host posting. So YE Phone, she's here, she's helping us and assisting. She'll be posting a lot of links there for you at the end of the webinar. Okay, so at the end, you're going to have a lot of useful links, including links to Dr. Houda and links to the NCMC. The Q&A tab, though, is for you. So please do write your questions. Feel free to start as early as you want. And usually the questions that come early get more votes and they do get asked. Sometimes not all questions get answered because we run out of time. So please do think about your question as soon as possible and place it there. And for those of you who may not have a question, we invite you to upvote the questions of others that you like and would like to prioritize to see them actually being answered by Dr. Houda. The recording will be made available at a later date on our website, and it will sit beside the other 7 webinars, which are already there for your viewing. So with that, let's get started on the important stuff, which is why you're here today. So again, today's webinar, Reframing Peace, Islamic Principles, Local Realities, and Women's Inclusion, will be delivered to you by Dr. Houda Abadi, who is the Executive Director of Transformative Peace. She will tell you a little bit more about herself as she goes along, but let's actually already give her the floor so that she can already entertain us and educate us in this really important combination of topics. Dr. Houda, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Horacio. Good afternoon, everyone. It is with great honor and privilege to be amongst you today. And I want to especially thank you, Horacio, for inviting me to be part of these very thought-provoking webinars. And I also want to wish happy Thanksgiving to all those that are celebrating in North America. I'm very excited to be amongst you today. As you mentioned, I am the Executive Director of Transformative Peace, and we are a mission-based consultancy that works on 3 major thematics. One is women, peace, and security, which you will hear a little bit of it today from the presentation. The second one is inclusive forms of peace building or conflict transformation. And last one is the prevention of violence or violent extremism. So to start, I'm just going to share my screen. And yeah, perfect.
I can see it.
You can see it.
But it's not in presentation mode yet. Yeah. Now it's good.
Wonderful. So from experience, I have seen how bottom-up approaches to conflict resolution and world's most pressing issues is really what makes peace inclusive, transformative, and sustainable. When Western conceptions of conflict resolution alone, and I'm pushing on alone, are used as the benchmark, they can often overlook local, traditional, even religious nuance. And this can delegitimize the process and not give it a chance to take root because it does not build on local ownership. and it doesn't help for sustainability. In the current global context, where violent conflict is at its highest level since 1946, it is essential for us to rethink how we do peace building. Definitely, there is something that is missing if we are at our highest point in terms of violent conflict that we are witnessing today. So, relying solely on externally imposed frameworks often overlooks the importance of local knowledge, resources, and lived reality. So really, there is a pressing need to explore innovative strategies that engage communities directly, ensures that peace building efforts are both effective and enduring. And this is what this presentation is all about today. Not to say that this is how peace building should look like or the only way to do peace building, but how we need to think outside of the box and to rethink ways of how we can do peace building in ways that really kind of push more for local ownership and encourage sustainability within local communities, because we have definitely failed if this is the highest level of violent conflict that the world is experiencing at a global scale. Religion is often discussed as a very divisive in conflict. But we also know through history that there is a rich history of mediation and conflict resolution efforts that have been led by religious actors that draw on core tenets of different religious beliefs, faiths. And the field of conflict transformation only recently, in the last 30 years or so, has begun to recognize a role of religion within peace building processes. However, even today, we still see secular and religious peace building processes in their own silos and not talking to one another, or sometimes not very well integrated, or there's this discomfort whenever you use the word religious peace building. And I want to share with you a famous hadith or a saying that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said to his followers, quote, "Shall I inform you of a better act than fasting, alms, and prayers? Make peace between one another." So when discussions on Islam, rights, and peace building come up, we often ascribe, especially in the West, negative meanings to Islamic systems, and this erases the region's historic and social specificities. But it also not only that, but it does not allow you to take different tools from the vast, rich peace building toolbox of Islamic principles in peace building. So integrating local and international frameworks in peace building is essential for ensuring that peace efforts are not only effective, but as I mentioned, sustainable and legitimate, have legitimacy within local communities. As we know, legitimacy and trust are the main core tenets to ensure local ownership. So by building on local capacities, resources, knowledge, and lived realities, peace building initiatives move beyond rigid, externally imposed templates. And this approach allows for a deeper appreciation of diverse worldviews and fosters a greater understanding of the local context in which peace building takes place. A critical advantage of this integration is the creation of processes that have a genuine chance to take root, as they are firmly anchored in local ownership. And when the communities see that their own practices and perspectives are reflected in peace building efforts, the resulting process gains legitimacy and acceptance. And I will share throughout the presentation some examples of these in my work in the MENA region. For example, a woman faith-based leader involved in one such project expressed, quote, she stated, "For the first time, I feel I am not a lab rat experiment, not talked down, but we are respected and listened to." End of quote. So her testimony highlights the importance of feeling heard, feeling seen, feeling respected, and an appreciation of inclusion of different modes of doing things. This approach also enables peace builders to address harmful norms, and this is specifically when I talk about women, peace, and security or gender norms, and barriers to inclusion using frameworks that are more likely to be embraced by the local community members. For instance, one example is of a religious male leader, and this is why it's really interesting because it was a man leader. It was a male leader who was inspired by women, peace, and security Islamic frameworks, which is something that I have discussed for a very long time in my work. And that was introduced in some of the work that we were doing together. And then he launched his own initiative with young men in the mosque, and he called it prophetic masculinity. And basically, what it did is that he was able to speak to young men in a safe space where young boys were feeling comfortable and feeling safe, but on what does it mean to have healthy masculinity or positive masculinity, but using the example of the prophet. And this is why he called his like circles prophetic masculinity. And this was a male figure trying to push for women, peace, and security initiatives. So indigenous mechanisms for resolving conflicts emphasize foundational principles such as social cohesion, harmony, peaceful coexistence, transparency, respect, and tolerance. And these values shape how disputes are addressed and resolved, ensuring that the process is both meaningful and contextually relevant. And so we will see throughout the presentation how there is an emphasis within the Islamic frameworks for peace building, an emphasis on renewing relationship, where the process or the how to get into a peace agreement is as equally or sometimes even more important for rebuilding trust, where social harmony and social cohesion are key critical elements. So why Islamic frameworks for peace building? Why is this even important? Well, first, we cannot deny, regardless of our own personal views on religion and secularism, that religion plays a vital, important role in Muslim majority societies, regardless of the personal views, right? And according to the latest data of the Arab Barometer surveys, religion continues to play an important role in Muslim majority societies. And the vast majority of residents describe themselves as religious. And so we can't deny this factor. So within Muslim majority societies, therefore, it makes total sense for peace builders to reflect not only on just ways that Islam has been instrumentalized to influence violent conflict, but on ways that Islam can help resolve violent conflicts. And so even in our research, for instance, in Afghanistan, when perceptions of human rights laws were viewed as not aligned with Islam, they were less likely to accept it. Right now, for instance, Morocco has been for the last couple of years negotiating and pushing for family law code. And it cannot be done without using religious arguments to push for reforms, especially on women's rights. So this is why we have to deal with this, especially in reforms such as inheritance, marriage, divorce. And this is even more pronounced in rural areas. So we really have to take this into consideration. So as such, adopting an Islamic framework in these settings becomes an attractive idea, one, because it bridges also the gap between the global north and the global south, which is sorely needed. So for instance, understanding what are the Islamic peace building principles, it will equip Western mediators to navigate cultural nuances and avoid misunderstandings that can hinder negotiations. So that's one. Second, it represents an indigenous form of conflict resolution that can gain greater understanding, resonance, buy-in, and utility within Muslim majority context. For instance, in my work in Iraq on women's inclusion and rights, tribal leaders had to see these rights also aligned with Islam to be able to push some of the restrictive gender norms. Third, it also creates more of an opening to address harmful norms and barriers to inclusion through a framework that is more likely to be accepted and adopted by local communities. So you don't hear, sometimes you go into different communities and they're like, oh, they're trying to change our mode of living, they're imposing Western values on us. So when you are adopting more of an indigenous form of conflict resolution, you're more able to address these harmful norms without creating this complete resistance. There is more of an opening. You're creating an opening. And very importantly, an Islamic framework to peace building converges with fundamental international human rights norms, meaning that the adoption of an Islamic framework would not come at the expense of fundamental human rights. And at the same time, it would resonate with the target audience, which can make a big difference between success and failure. And lastly, it puts the focus on the process and on the how, meaning human relations, community harmony. So it's not just about ending aggression or resolving a conflict or coming very quickly to a peace agreement, but it's also the renewal of relationships. So the process is equally important. And that means that there is more of an emphasis on positive peace, where it's not just the absence of violence, but the process to creating peaceful societies is as equally important. So there's much more emphasis on positive peace. But what this does not mean, because I got a lot of times these questions, doesn't mean like, it's like, well, are you imposing, Islamic norms in peace building? Absolutely not. It's not imposing or affirming religious law. It's not eliminating the secular space or not respecting human rights. It is actually the relationship between human rights and Islam needs to be framed in terms of synergy and mutual influence rather that it is in a permanent state of antagonism. So in fact, Islam is fundamentally rooted in the same tenets of peace, equity, and justice that we see also. So having said all of this, it's also very key and very important. I think you're in Abu Dhabi right now, if that's correct. Yes, that basically there is a plurality of interpretations within the Islamic jurisprudence over law, governance, political power. So I just want to make sure that our viewers understand that it's not a monolith. So for instance, what works might work in North Africa, in Morocco, in Tunisia, might be a bit different from what works in Abu Dhabi or in Iraq, etc. There is a diversity and a richness, but it creates at least something, it gives us something that we are able to work from, okay? And for instance, while I want to use an example in my work in Afghanistan, for instance, the Taliban, before the fall of the regime, the Taliban, they insisted on Islamic principles when they were talking about women's rights. They were like, well, we respect women's rights according to Islamic Sharia, which is like the human interpretation of the fiqh of the Islamic law. But it was very ambiguous on how they were deploying these Islamic references, meaning like, what do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean when they say according to the Islamic Sharia? What is it? Can you please define this term so it is not ambiguous? Because if you say that according to the fiqh, to the Islamic law, women are not encouraged, like they have, it's an obligation for them to go to school and have education. This is a right. And so how are you defining this? So it is really important to close the gap of ambiguity and to ensure that it is defined so we can understand what it is, inclusivity, and like work from there. Or when you would say we're respecting women's rights according to Islamic tenets, what tenets are you using? Can you please have this conversation? So this at least opens the door to be able to negotiate, right? And to go back and forth and open a discussion. And this brings me to the importance of building a common vocabulary. If you can see the picture of the guy, he's taking a photo and he's looking for the penguin, but the penguin is behind him and telling him like, should I tell him I'm behind me? I mean, he has the best camera and he has all of the equipment and he thinks he is good to go, but he's missing a big thing, right? So basically, to build sufficient consensus, there needs to be clarity on what terms mean for the different parties, including the emotions, the fears, the insecurities that are invoked by them. By exploring these issues further, dialogue, space, and trust building mechanisms may be created. Because words have basically meaning and consequences, and they have connotations and different associations. And for instance, I want to use an example of a mediator that I was with in one of the workshops that shared her experience in the Belfast Agreement that brought an end to more than 30 years of sectarian violence. Women's groups succeeded. She was discussing how women's groups succeeded in building an inclusive peace process that culminated in women's equal participation and socioeconomic inclusion. And one way to do that for her was to remove ambiguity and define and understand the concepts. And they wanted to make sure that pertinent issues that had some resistance were defined or framed through a cultural framework that they would understand, that their community would understand. So for instance, in Northern Ireland, negotiations, mediators discussed honorable accommodations instead of the word compromise, because the men at the table saw that the word compromise was weak and emasculating. And so as such, they changed that and used the word honorable accommodation was deployed to build sufficient consensus. The same thing applies to human rights and social justice. The mediating team realized that communities had a good grasp of social justice and what it means, but they associated women's rights and equated it with some kind of uprising against them. And so it's is here when you start to think about what do these words mean. In my work, for instance, in North Africa and the MENA region, I don't use the word feminism because feminism ascribes a specific negative feeling in a lot of these communities because they look at it as Western imposed lack of rights, etc. And so this is where it's very important to really understand the local context to be able to push things through. These slides show, I just want to highlight briefly some Islamic peace building principles that are derived from various Islamic sources. For instance, the importance of the shura or consultations, basically, which is innate part of Islamic peace building tenets, which is similar when we're talking about participatory processes. So this is something that comes from within that we can use when we're thinking about consultations. And the table on your right looks at some of the differences, right, of basically in conflict resolutions. And these major differences are important if we are to avoid misunderstandings that can hinder negotiations. For instance, Western approaches often emphasize principles such as impartiality, right? We always hear it. Impartiality, neutrality, adherence to universal human rights standards. And mediators in these frameworks are typically expected to remain neutral and detached from parties involved, focusing on procedure and getting to a formal agreement. In contrast, local approaches, particularly those rooted in Islamic context, may prioritize trusted community figures, right? As mediators, individuals who possess deep social networks and the ability to actually exert influence on the community. So they're not seen as neutral, but they have the power to exert or to push for specific agreements within the community. And so in these settings, trust and credibility are established through established relationships and knowledge of cultural nuances rather than just strict neutrality. And so knowledge of these nuances fosters trust and credibility and provides a more informed engagement with more likelihood to get buy-in to at least when we're going in, we're understanding how these are viewed. I want to move a bit to gender and peace building and why it matters. So, a women's inclusion in peace building processes is crucial, critical to achieving sustainable and effective peace building. And it all flows together because when we're talking about Islamic principles for peace building, women are a big part of it. And so, how do we do this? Their unique perspective, women's unique perspectives, commitment, and inclusive approaches contribute to the overall effectiveness of peace building efforts. Women often have access to vulnerable populations that may be closed off to men. They enable them to build trust and gather critical information to inform better policy making. And their influence and access within communities helps ensure that peace building strategies are responsive to human insecurity, address specific vulnerabilities faced by different groups. And I've been in so many rooms where there's been men and women, and I would give a paper and I would say security. And I would give a piece of paper to men and women, and I say, when you see this word security, what does it mean to you? And the responses are completely different from what we receive, the responses from men and from the responses of women, even on how they view security within their community. So this is why it's really important to make sure that the process is as inclusive as possible. And research has shown that women's voices are crucial to reducing conflict and advancing stability and building lasting peace. The higher the level of gender equality, the more there's a lower propensity for conflict, both between and within states. And a UN study has found that women's participation in peace agreements increases the sustainability of agreement by 35%. And peace agreements negotiated with women involved are more likely to last beyond 15 years. This is further supported by another study conducted by Nielsen showing that peace agreements are 64% less likely to fail when women's organization and civil society are involved in the agreement and the implementation process. The adoption of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 was a milestone because it recognized for the first time the gendered impact of armed conflict on women and girls and the critical roles that they play as active agents in peace and security. The resolution called all actors to enhance women's participation in peace process and established 4 fundamental pillars: participation, prevention, protection, relief, and recovery. And we just had basically the 25th anniversary. We just celebrated the 25th anniversary of 1325. And we've been mapping like what are some of the gaps and what are some of the opportunities. Unfortunately, women's participation in peace processes still remains low. While it brought gender issues to the forefront and created a global framework to a variety of contexts, its implementation has fallen short. So, for instance, out of 31 peace processes between 1992 and through 2011, only 3 had women-led mediators. Okay, so only 3 women-led mediators from 1992 through 2011. Okay, none had female signatories, and only 14 had female representation on the negotiating team. Okay, which takes me to this next slide, which looks at peace agreements, and this is taken from the data of a University of Edinburgh PACS data show. And it shows that women continue to face marginalization. We don't have a lot of time to go over each one, but just to showcase that women continue to face underrepresentation and are frequently relegated to secondary or supporting roles due to persistent either patriarchal norms or socio-political barriers, okay? And this was between 2000 through 2024. This data is taken from the Council on Foreign Relations on peace processes, and we can see from 2000 through 2024, there have been only 13% of negotiators that are women, okay? And out of that, 12 of 52 had 20 had between 20 to 30 female negotiators. Which takes me to why is it important for us to have an Islamic support if we're thinking of Muslim majority countries and women's inclusion within peace processes? Why is it important to have an Islamic to look at the to look at to approach gender equality not only through a secular lens but also through religious frameworks? Approaching gender equality only through a secular lens may deprive gendered frameworks from sources of religious legitimacy and values that could empower women's rights and facilitate the renegotiation of gender norms and relationships. As I mentioned, the two previous slides that I showed, it shows barriers to all women, right? It's not only within Muslim majority countries, but then when we're thinking of Muslim majority countries, there are also specific gender struggles that Muslim women face. And sometimes they face a double burden that I will discuss in a little bit. So this is why it's also even important for us to look and explore this issue. It is crucial to dismantle the false dichotomies between often associated with Islam, particularly regarding women's rights. An Islamic framework is fully reconcilable with the pursuit of gender equalities, and women's inclusion is a must for sustainable peace. As I mentioned, especially now I am in Morocco, in the negotiations of the family law code, Islamic references and Islamic arguments are used actually to promote women's rights and to change some of the restrictive rights that women right now experience. So this is why it's very important. And a lot of women's rights groups are using historical examples of the Quran and the lives of the Prophet to inform new understanding of masculinities and femininities. And as such, it opens space for women's participation and expands the roles of both men and women in the public and the private sphere. Values related to women's inclusion within Islam are supported by not just the number of women that are mentioned in the Quran, and there are plenty, right? But by the centrality and importance of some of those roles, right? And as I said, a lot of women are relegated to supporting roles. We've seen like women, the very small minutiae percentage of women who are female negotiators as an example. And so this is why it's very important for us to even look at the historical context where women played an active role, but because religion is still dominated mostly as a male-dominated space, a lot of these stories are not known as much within the public or even studied. And this is why it's very important. So historically, for instance, women played an active role in selecting the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Their roles were not relegated only to very small subsidiary roles. And so as such, Islamic frameworks can serve as a powerful source of legitimacy for gender equality, countering the cultural norms that perpetuate patriarchal structures. And these frameworks reflect the Quranic values, contrasting with the customary sometimes cultural practices that may undermine women's rights. Because when conceptions of equality and empowerment are indigenous to the community or the society, they have a higher chance of being sustainable. And I have seen this in my work on women's issues and women's rights in the MENA region. It plays a very, very powerful role. But however, despite the Quran's advocacy and the principles of equality and justice for all, women still face significant barriers that include patriarchal and cultural norms on the one hand, lack of accountability and implementation mechanisms. Sometimes you see like some of the best constitutions where women's rights are granted within the constitutions, but in terms of implementation, there is none. And then third, instrumentalization by national and foreign policy agendas. And a lot of times women's rights, especially within the Muslim world, has been instrumentalized and has created even more harm within the local communities. And so many of the local socio-cultural norms that limit women's rights in Muslim majority countries are often framed or justified in religious or Islamic terms, but in fact are only human interpretations of the religious law, meaning that it is rooted in tribalism or in patriarchal customs and not in the religious tenets. And this is why religious literacy becomes very important when it comes to women's rights and negotiating women's rights. And so making these distinctions or divorcing what is cultural and what is religious becomes very important. Given the centrality of religion for many communities, distinguishing between what is religiously rooted and what is rooted in custom is crucial for establishing a religious justification for new understanding of women's position in society. And when communicating between communities, finding the common ground is important, and religion can become a lucrative source for intersectional common ground and local custom. And lastly, a religious framework that distinguishes between custom and what is Islamic can empower feminist perspective, which identify with the Quranic support for equalities. It basically opens possibilities for reinterpretation, renegotiation that is less prone to invoke defensiveness. To ensure inclusivity, several elements are critical. And you can see in the middle, like the building of inclusion, this is the main goal, right? And so first, it is crucial, like I mentioned before, so I'm going to go really fast, is to remove ambiguity to ensure foundational concepts are well understood and cannot be misused to justify restrictive or discriminatory practices. The example I shared with you in terms of the Taliban, according to Islamic law, what do they mean by that? Second is the diversification of of sources of Islamic law, and by that by examining different entry points and drawing from a broad spectrum of Islamic jurisprudence and scholarly thought, the framework becomes more inclusive and adaptable. And this approach allows for a richer, more nuanced understanding that can address the diverse realities faced by diverse communities. Third, accountability measures. I think this is very important and clear, right? To make sure like it safeguards and ensures legitimacy. And lastly, engaging the public is very, very important. I'm gonna say very quickly, to overcome resistance, we have to move away from gender equality being a zero-sum game to a win-win, right? And we do this by examining different entry points. We challenge men to become agents of change, where they feel they have a say in the process. We focus on the collective benefits for inclusion and meaningful representation. And so, for instance, when I do work on WPS, I work with men and boys too in transformative ways, and I bring them in with me. So it's not a competition, or sometimes they feel like it's a competition over resources, but it's a collaboration. Social harmony, social cohesion is the most important thing. The messenger is sometimes more important even than the message itself, meaning like legitimacy is key. We see sometimes that there are official institutions that go and give different messages, but there is a lack of legitimacy within the community. So we really need to understand who these people who are carrying this message is. We need to model gender partnerships through teams. And this is why I wanted to share that 13% of negotiators are only women. So if we are advocating, or if the West is advocating that we need, like gender equality, then the teams need to reflect that as well, that are doing the negotiation, because this is the example that you are providing to the people you are working with. Promoting religious literacy, we spoke a lot about that, on how it is very important and equips and empower women to be able to talk for themselves. And also engaging women who are resistant to change. But I want to share a very, I think, powerful story, at least it was powerful to see, of a senior Moroccan female religious scholar who shared her challenges in gaining access to preach in the mosques in the late 1980s. And I was doing this interview with her. And she shared that at that time, the Moroccan constitution allowed only Moroccan men to preach inside the mosque. And in her fight to change the law, she cited surah, it's called Surah Tawbah, verse 71. But I'm going to quote the surah very quickly, where she wanted to make a point to the Ministry of Religious Affairs that God does not differentiate between men and women and that the space needs to be opened for women. And the verse says, quote, "The believers, both men and women, are guardians of one another. They encourage good and forbid evil, establish prayers and pay alms and obey Allah and His Messenger," end of quote. She said that she used this verse during negotiations for 2 years. She was negotiating with the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And finally, after 2-year battle, the article in the Constitution was changed. And now we have a lot of murshidat, which is like religious teachers, female religious teachers inside the mosque, who are able to preach and give lessons to other women. So she was not only granted permission to preach, but she opened the door for other women. And so many women now are breaking the glass ceiling and opening the space for younger generations of women. But the unfortunate thing is that these initiatives are not very well known beyond the direct circles of impact, and they're not something that we also read about. And so they remain very local, very small circles, and it needs to be spoken about a little bit more. And I just want to conclude very quickly with 10 main recommendations, and then we open it for questions, is that language matters and it can evoke visceral emotions. It can either be used to protect women's freedoms or it could be used to discriminate against them. And as such, it is really critical to frame the conflict constructively, to encourage productive communication, define the terms and concepts to close the gaps of community. Second, women should be included in all processes of peace building. Third, women's inclusion rights should not be viewed in isolation, but as part of democratization and protection for human rights for all, meaning that social and economic rights are essential to facilitate women's meaningful participation in political processes. A whole of society approach will enable different entry points where gender equality is not seen as a zero-sum game, but a win-win. Fourth, the inclusion of women from various different backgrounds is critical. We have to avoid a savior mentality and instrumentalization of women. And we need to address differential and understand what are the differential vulnerabilities and unequal power relations that will lead to normative change and increased participation. Fifth, I've mentioned how a secular approach imposed by international bodies will not resolve these conflicts. The international community needs to distance itself also from patriarchal interpretations of Islam as authoritative and give Muslim women the agency and space to change the terms of reference from within. Sixth, constitutional development should not be viewed as a once-off moment of achieving a constitution. It is iterative, and in fact, understanding the process of review, changing the constitution over time is important. I gave examples of Morocco right now that we are looking at changing the family law code, the mudawana, and negotiations are in process. So it's something that is constant and cannot be divorced from the ground realities and ongoing political negotiations. Seven, which is why this is important, is that mediators can draw on Islamic jurisprudence when showcasing varied Islamic opinions on the subject matter. Integrating indigenous forms of conflict resolution in non-Western contexts is important because it builds legitimacy, response to local needs, and builds upon local capacities. Eight, we have to promote inclusion and diversity through a humanist reading of the Quran, and the prophetic tradition is key to addressing gender bias. The goal is to empower women and girls, but also draw men and boys in gender transformative ways. So it's seen as a community issue and not as a competition or struggle. 9, we have to engage male faith-based scholars who have the moral and spiritual legitimacy to be allies and advocates. They can provide concrete suggestions on how they can support positive behavior and attitudes. And also, a lot of times I say we have to distance ourselves from embassy imams, meaning the imams that go from embassy to embassy that are known but don't have as much legitimacy within the local community. So we need to do our homework to really see who are these individuals that actually have legitimacy and trust and respect from the local community. And lastly, just women's religious literacy and education is absolutely critical and empowers women for them to negotiate and reclaim their own narratives and rights. And as I mentioned, when conceptions of equality and empowerment are indigenous to the community or society, they have a higher chance of being sustainable. Thank you so much.
Dr. Houda, thank you so very much for that illuminating session. It's part of this, exactly the NCMC webinar series, is that expansion of views and trying to see different ideas and different angles. And this was, for me, very enriching because I'm not a woman and I'm not Muslim and I don't live in a Muslim majority society. So getting all of that was extremely rich for me and hopefully for the audience as well, even those who might be closer to those identities you described. So with that, we have a few questions. Let me remind people to then take a minute or two to think about their questions and also vote on other questions you might like. So let me start over here. Let me just do a quick, which one already has the most upvotes? So the sixth one is actually just one for now because people are probably just warming up. So thanks for your thoughts, provoking ideas. Still, while speaking about Islamic frameworks as an example of to help international conflict negotiation, how do you explain the tensions within Muslim communities themselves?
Yes, very good question. Thank you for the questions. I think tensions and conflict are innate everywhere. And I think we have to move away that it is specific to just specific communities. However, we need to look at the power dynamics, like how international power structures are influencing local dynamics within specific countries. And I'm just going to give an example of like women's movements, for instance. Women's movement in the Muslim majority country, a lot of times there's a lot of tensions between different women's movements. Why? Because on the one hand, like Muslim women face a double burden. There's on the one hand, Muslims' rights were used or instrumentalized for foreign invasions. And so with what we have seen, for instance, in Afghanistan, long time. Right. And so when women's rights or women's groups are trying sometimes to advocate for women's rights using secular claims, some other women's groups, there is tension because they're like, you're representing international agenda. And so what it has done is that it had created a division between religious and secular different women's movements in several countries. And a lot of times they don't talk with each other, or they mistrust, they don't have a lot of trust, or they don't come into the same table. And so these are some things that needs to specifically be worked on, but to just look at the issues that we are facing right now. And I think this is how we can have answers from a very intersectional approach, meaning from different components, or how are different issues impacting or affecting conflict, and how is it impacting a solution for us to get to a solution. I hope it has helped.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you, just for me, because maybe, again, my cultural distance, how would you use the Islamic framework exactly? Like give me an example on a specific to get those Muslim groups closer to one another, especially if they come from different interpretations, as you said in one of your 10 principles, different sources and all, but still that might actually go against the ambiguity that you also said that we have to work again to reduce them as much. So by bringing different sources and reducing ambiguity, you might be creating a tension. How do you settle on that?
I think what we have done in the guide to Islamic frameworks to peace building, we have relied mostly on the Islamic first principles, which is agreed upon from the majority of the Muslim majority community. And again, this is not to just look at, again, it's not just saying like we're not looking at secular frameworks, but this is in addition. So for
Mhm.
instance, shura, consultation, this is something that we have used. It's something that I worked on when I was living and working in the United States, but working on Syria, where we were working with different Syrian groups at that time, and we were using the concept of shura or consultation to showcase that this is coming from within. We're not imposing consultations, but this is a concept that is completely understood within the community. And so this is why it was important for us to do consultations. Second, for instance, in my work in Iraq on women's issues, it was very important when we were using like Islamic concepts to be able to advocate for women's rights, because there is no ambiguity that, for instance, education is a right, an innate law within the Islamic law for women. And so to be able to define those terms, it was very important. But when the tribal leaders, for instance, saw that we were not using concepts just as like, oh, feminism, or this is, then they felt like this is a Western imposition to change our way of life. But when we used terms or frameworks that were understood by the local community, they were more willing to listen, and then to see how then the tribal leaders themselves started trying to support, how can we support the women in the community or change the mindset of some of the men within the community. Does it make sense?
It
Or
does make a lot of sense. Yes,
yeah.
thank you.
Mhm.
So, and if there are different interpretations, like two Muslim communities, one majority, one minority, like Sunnis, Shias, how would you then broker that ambiguity or that diversity of opinion? I'm exploring the first question. I'm just going a little deeper for those on the audience who are wondering where I'm coming from.
Yeah. So again, this is why this was one of our major questions. It's like, okay, well, how do you look at the Shia and the Sunni divide? And we really wanted to stay away from the, make this become a hurdle. There are some things that Shias and Sunnis both believe in, like the Islamic principles. Um,
Mm,
I didn't have time to showcase, but like the Charter of the Medina or the prophetic tradition or the Quranic sources, these are before, like the division happened within the Muslim Ummah, between Shia and Sunni. So
yeah,
these are concepts that are agreed upon that we could work from. So,
I see.
which means like it doesn't, or like I'm trying to bring some of the, let's see, like some of the concepts of the Islamic, um, like for instance, seeing like peace is a collective responsibility, right? Or
Mm,
the fact that, it's agreements need to be respected. All of these come from like early Islamic principles where there isn't a division between different groups on how these different groups see them. And also, to be honest with you, also when we talk about issues of inclusivity and tolerance, it was something that we were able to look into. It's like how did the prophet like in the charter of the Medina or in early like in the early Islamic days, how did they deal with those differences and the diversity? How was it celebrated? And so we were able to use these Islamic sources to showcase like it's not about being the same and one, but it's about how can we live in a community where there is social harmony. This is the goal, not the goal that we
wonderful.
are all the same.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So let me move on to a few more questions because there are quite a few here. So one is the title for today was Peace Building, which in my understanding, the person asking applies to war situations. Most of your examples refer to situations about conflicts or modernization of rules and laws where there's not necessarily a war. At least that was the understanding there. Can you clarify if there's a difference between war situations and the other types of conflicts or modernizations, initiatives, and policymaking where there's no conflict but a negotiation process?
Mhm. A good question. So, a lot of the examples are, as I mentioned before, in Islam, like peace is seen as it's not just the absence of war, it's positive peace, right? If we're looking and we're thinking about how can we make sure that we live in more, in less conflict right now, I said it's the highest level of conflicts that we have experienced. How can we prevent these wars from happening or these conflicts from happening? Then we need to see how can we promote or think about positive peace, which is not just the absence of violence, but
Hmm.
how can we ensure that communities feel that their rights are respected, etc., where they don't fall into violence. That's number one. Number two, a lot of these examples also, for instance, like women's issues, these came from also foreign invasions, from wars specifically, and these are elements that now in the region you have to work on after some of these wars have ended, like post,
Hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
so, for instance, like women's issues, the way that they were instrumentalized in the Muslim world, these are impact or effects that have impacted women's rights or women's issues in the Muslim world that we are working on. The issue of the shura was during the Syrian war that we were working on. And at that time, I was working at the Carter Center. And when we used the word shura, we were working with Syrians across ideological and political spectrum, from the most secular to the most religious. And when we were bringing them together, we had to create this common ground. And so using the word shura or like cessation of violence or trying to negotiate for cessation of violence, we also saw like like some of the Islamic frameworks that could support the push for cessation of violence or to do consultations or make sure that we're speaking to everyone. And then lastly, a lot of times in formal negotiations to end war, women are not included because in the West, if you're seeing like who is brought into the negotiating room, there's a lot of times emphasis on people that have carried arm, which are men. And so working with women behind the scenes in parallel is a way to support building peace in the community.
Thank you so much. I think we have room for one more question. And as I warned you, this is a business school audience after all. So let's just preparing you mindset wise. So the question reads, what are your thoughts on an organization's public commitment to advancing gender equality? Example, implementing policies to ensure equal representation in public events or strengthening hiring and retention practices. Do you find those to be effective if you have any experience or related experience from peace building process into that?
I love this question. So thank you
So
for
it's a
this.
good one to finish, right? So that would be wonderful. Thank you.
I love this question. And yes, it's not just peace building. As I mentioned, I work on women, peace, and security as well, right? And yes, absolutely. I think it is critical. But there are a few things. One, we need to make sure we don't tokenize women, which has been sometimes the issue. So sometimes we can see, like I've worked in major international development projects where I've seen like there has been pressure. Well, the donors say that they want, 50% women participants or 40% women participants. So there isn't really a genuine desire, like it's more tokenized, like, okay, it's a checkbox. Okay, we have these
Yeah.
women, check, now on to next. So we really shouldn't, this is not the way to do it. The way to do it is to have a genuine inclusion and what it means, right? The second thing is a lot of times I see or I hear in organizations, well, we just didn't find a woman expert. No, absolutely no. And I've experienced this a lot of times where I would hear, like we need a woman expert on Syria or on Yemen, or we couldn't find one, like, and and I've been in rooms sometimes where it's all male dominated. We have to do a better job in doing our own homework, in ensuring that
Mhm.
uh, we, we, we do our homework to map who these women are and to make sure that they are included. That's the second one. And then also to make sure that we basically emulate or have a team, like the team, like for instance, if we have these gender quotas or a public commitment in an organization, this organization should role model this behavior. And role modeling this behavior goes beyond just the number of women that you have in your team. Giving expertise. Are there women in senior leadership positions? When a woman is speaking in a meeting, is she listened to? I think as a business school, there's a lot of research that has been done that showcases that in a meeting, for instance, women leaders sometimes are interrupted more than when men are in a meeting. So how are we modeling this, in practice? And are we an example to other organizations of what healthy, inclusion means and genuine inclusion? So we have to move away from tokenization and just number checkbox to more genuine inclusion.
Thank you. Dr. Houda, unfortunately, I'm going to have to stop because of time. At the hour, the people drop off and they have other things to do because they're all over the world and some are just starting their day. So I just wanted to invite the audience to show their love with some of the reactions. And since you cannot see us clapping, I'll clap on their behalf. And thank you so much for joining us. I will show a couple of slides, including those the links that you asked us to share with them so that they can connect with you and you can help each other out in pursuing the messages of peace building, inclusion, and women as you brought to us in such an illuminating way. So Dr. Houda, once again, thank you so much for the rest of the audience.
Thank you for having me and wishing everyone a wonderful day, the rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And for now, let me share the slides as you asked and as we do here at the end of our sessions real quickly. Remember, the links will be all put also on the chat. But for those of you who prefer a QR code here, a couple. One to learn more about Dr. Houda's organization and another one for her LinkedIn. So I'll allow you the little time there to take the photos. Remember, the slides will also be made available on the website. Dr. Houda, I don't know if we're going to have access to your slides.
I just have to see and then I'll get back to you.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I really did not remember what we discussed. Yes. For those who would like to join the NCMC mailing list, we're producing our mailing list. We promise we're not going to be jamming your email box. It's just to send the occasional information. Here is just a thank you to all of our previous webinar speakers. And now Dr. Houda joins the crowd. If you see at the very bottom there, our ncmc at INSEAD.edu, we're looking for suggestions of speakers for next year. We do have a list already. But given that we have now the access to you, maybe you have an author or two that you really like and would like to see them addressing us and helping us. So please do share that with us and we'll try to extend the invitations to them as well. Here are a couple of the books that were recently published by the NCMC, including myself, The Farmer, Price, and Power, and The Negotiators Who Changed the World, which is the more recent one, which has about 30 chapters talking about different public figures as negotiators, such as Jesus Christ, Lech Walesa, and the one that I wrote on Sheikh Zayed, here representing the UAE. So here's a little bit of links for you to go there and hopefully get a discount on it as well. And last but not, there's the NCW, our negotiation course for the world. So you can get free materials in several languages for negotiation teaching. Actually, Dr. Houda, there's here one in Arabic. So you can get all sorts of negotiation materials produced by us, translated professionally into Arabic. We are shooting for publishing all 130 languages by next year in a wiki style so that people can improve and help us out as opposed to us becoming bottlenecks and trying to improve them by ourselves. And finally, here's some resources, articles, and others. Some of those were already listed in previous session. I think the most recent one is the one on the top right, expert perspectives on Trump's tariff negotiations, which has a couple of articles, actually about 5 or 6 articles from different professors addressing different aspects of those negotiations for your education. So with that, then, I will formally say thank you for all of those who waited until now. Thank you once again, Dr. Houda, for being our last speaker of the year. And I really much look forward to our lineup for next year and seeing you again. Thank you very much, and I hope this was a valuable addition to your year in terms of negotiation learning.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers.